August 2nd, 216 BC. 6 hours. 70,000 men. Not a siege, not a plague, not a slow collapse spread across decades of rot and bad governance. 6 hours of daylight on a flat field in southern Italy, and one of the greatest armies Rome had ever assembled stopped existing as a military force. The field at Cannae didn't just swallow soldiers. It swallowed a generation. It swallowed a strategy. It swallowed the Roman certainty that discipline, numbers, and willpower were enough. But here's the thing, the comfortable version never says loudly enough. Rome did not simply lose at Cannae. Rome helped build the trap, decision by decision, month by month, through pride and politics, and the particular Roman inability to accept that a smarter enemy was reading them like a map. By the time 70,000 men stood on that plain, Hannibal had already won. They just hadn't stopped walking. That's the story, not the heroic version, not the military genius versus Roman stubbornness version. The version where an institution destroys itself from the inside and calls it courage on the way down. If this is the kind of history you came for, the one they don't teach cleanly, subscribe now. This channel goes where the comfortable version stops. It starts at a lake, and about 15,000 dead Romans who didn't have to die. 217 BC. Hannibal has already crossed the Alps, a feat so improbable that military historians still debate the exact route. And he's in northern Italy, winning. Not devastatingly, not yet, but winning enough to matter, and winning in a way that should have told Rome something crucial. This general doesn't want your cities. He wants your armies. He wants to kill Rome's capacity to fight, not by besieging its walls, but by erasing its legions one engagement at a time. Rome sent armies north. Rome lost those armies. The pattern was right there to read. Nobody read it before Trasimene. The consul Gaius Flaminius was politically ambitious, personally reckless, and carrying the burden of a prior military embarrassment the aristocratic Senate had never let him forget. He needed a victory, publicly, demonstrably, in a way that closed the case on his reputation. Hannibal understood this. He moved south through Etruria, burning farms and raiding countryside, not primarily for supplies, but because he knew what Roman farmland burning did to a consul running for political survival. Flaminius watched it happen and could not afford to look passive. His officers warned him. He pursued anyway. They rode into a valley beside the lake at dawn, in fog. Hannibal's army was already there, hidden on the high ground on 3 sides, silent, waiting. When they moved, the battle lasted 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died. Flaminius died with them, run through by a Gallic horseman who reportedly didn't know who he was killing. But this was not the real mistake. The real mistake came next. The Senate, shaken, did something characteristically Roman. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, and what Fabius did, and what Rome did to Fabius for doing it, explains Cannae more than any cavalry charge. Fabius's strategy was straightforward and strategically correct. Do not give Hannibal a field engagement. Shadow him through the Italian hills. Cut off his foraging parties. Let the terrain and the seasons do what Roman swords kept failing to accomplish. Deny the Carthaginian the one thing he needed: a concentrated Roman army standing still, long enough to be encircled. It worked, imperfectly, but it worked. Hannibal could devastate the countryside. He could not force a decisive confrontation. He could not break Roman power if Roman power refused to hold still. Rome hated it. Not the soldiers, the politicians, the aristocratic families watching their rural estates burn while Fabius marched at a careful distance, the Italian allies being raided, wondering whether Rome still had the will to defend them. The Roman citizens who had a name for Fabius now, Cunctator, the Delayer. Said the way they said it, it carried contempt, not admiration. Fabius understood the danger. Rome understood only the humiliation. When his term expired, the Senate did not renew it. They returned to the standard system, 2 elected consuls, sharing daily command rotation. And in 216 BC, Rome elected 2 men whose combined instincts represented everything Fabius had spent 6 months trying to prevent. And this is where the Republic chose pride over strategy. Gaius Terentius Varro was a populist, elected against the Senate's preferred candidates, and he had campaigned on essentially one promise: find Hannibal and finish this. He reportedly said, publicly, that he would end the war on the day he saw the enemy. Hannibal, somewhere in Apulia, was counting on it. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the other consul, was experienced and cautious, but politically weakened by a prior corruption charge. Acquitted, yes, but Rome's political culture didn't forget acquittals. Paulus needed visible action to rebuild what the accusation had damaged. He understood the danger of a field engagement against Hannibal. He was going to participate in one anyway. By the time Varro took command on rotation, Hannibal no longer needed to chase Rome. Rome was coming to him. The combined army that marched to Cannae was somewhere between 70,000 and 87,000 men. Ancient sources vary, and the precise numbers remain debated. But even the most conservative estimates make this one of the largest armies Rome had ever fielded. Significantly larger than anything Hannibal commanded, the Senate's strategic logic was blunt: mass, overwhelm, drive forward, end it. What happened next was not courage. It was institutional panic wearing armor. The morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, the plain near the Aufidus River, flat and open in every direction. No forests, no hills, no terrain that could compensate for bad decisions. Hannibal had chosen this ground deliberately. His entire career pointed to it. He fought battles where terrain became part of the weapon. Trebia, Trasimene, always some geographic feature closing off an escape route, funneling Romans into a compressed killing space. Here, on this flat plain, there was no obvious geographic trick, just open ground, which meant Rome would see nothing to fear and come forward. And that was exactly the point. Hannibal gave Rome the battlefield it wanted. That was the trap. His formation looked, to Roman eyes, like an opponent presenting a vulnerable center. Gauls and Spaniards in the middle, less heavily armed than the African veterans, arranged in a line that bowed outward toward the Romans, a convex curve pressing slightly forward. His best cavalry on both flanks, his African veterans, disciplined, experienced, well-equipped, held back on the far edges of his line like closed parentheses around the whole arrangement. Rome looked at this and saw a weaker center to punch through. The battle opened the way ancient engagements typically did. Cavalry clashing on the flanks, while the infantry masses ground toward each other. On the Roman left, Hannibal's heavy Iberian and Gallic cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen there, faster, more completely, than anything in recent Roman military experience. On the other flank, the Numidians engaged the Italian allied cavalry in a grinding, inconclusive fight, neither winning nor losing, just keeping them occupied. Then the Roman center struck the Carthaginian center, and the Carthaginians gave ground. Not in panic, not in rout, in a controlled, deliberate, coordinated withdrawal. The Gauls and Spaniards stepping backward in unison, the convex bulge slowly flattening, then bending inward. The Romans pressed forward into what felt like progress. The center was breaking. The enemy was retreating. Push harder, drive deeper, close the ranks, add momentum, pour more men forward into the gap. And then, in the middle of what looked like victory, the Roman army began to disappear. The African veterans on both flanks pivoted inward. The cavalry that had destroyed Rome's horsemen on the left hadn't celebrated and held position. They had swung around the rear of the entire engagement and hit the Italian allied cavalry from behind. Those horsemen, already pinned by the Numidians from the front, had no room to turn. They shattered and fled. Hannibal's cavalry now controlled both flanks and the rear. The African infantry closed from the sides. The cavalry sealed the exit. 70,000 Romans, compressed together so tightly in the advance that men in the interior reportedly could not raise their arms to swing their swords, were inside a complete encirclement. The concave pocket the Roman center had marched into was now a closed fist. This maneuver, the double envelopment, the deliberate encirclement of a larger force through coordinated flank collapse, was studied in European military academies for 2,000 years after Cannae. The German Schlieffen Plan, which opened the First World War, was explicitly designed as a Cannae at continental scale. Every time a commander has tried to encircle and destroy an enemy force rather than simply push it back, they were reaching, consciously or not, for what Hannibal did on this plain. Inside the pocket, the Romans died. Not in minutes. That's what the numbers conceal. The killing took hours. The men in the interior couldn't fight. The men on the edges were too compressed to use their training effectively. Some units tried to break out in organized groups. Some succeeded. Most did not. The ancient historian Polybius, writing roughly a century and a half after the battle, drawing on earlier sources, describes the Roman dead lying in the configuration of how they fell: cavalry on the outside, infantry massed toward the center. Ancient sources place the Roman dead at somewhere between 47,000 and 70,000. Estimates for total casualties, including Allied forces, run higher. Scholars still debate the precise figures, but even the conservative numbers are catastrophic. By any serious historical measure, Cannae stands among the deadliest single days of battle in recorded warfare, not just in the ancient world, but in any era before industrial-scale killing became possible. Paulus died in the fighting. He had argued against the battle and died in it anyway. Varro, who had commanded, survived. He fled to Venusia with a remnant of cavalry and then had to come home and explain. Hannibal's losses. Ancient sources estimate around 6,000 men. Rome, when the news arrived, did something that tells you more about the Republic than any of its victories. The Senate met. The city was in genuine panic. 2 Vestal virgins were found to have broken their vows. In Roman religious thought, a catastrophic omen signaling divine anger at the state. 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls, a man and a woman each, were buried alive in the Forum Boreum in a ritual of purification. Livy records this without flinching. This is what Roman institutional religion looked like when the city believed it was close to erasure. The Senate then banned public mourning beyond 30 days. Rome could not afford to look like a state in collapse. Diplomats arrived from Carthage with terms. Families of captured soldiers, tens of thousands of Roman citizens now in Carthaginian hands, scraped together ransom money and sent delegations to the Senate begging for permission to buy their husbands and sons back. The Senate refused, not because they lacked the funds, because they couldn't afford the symbolism. To ransom the prisoners of Cannae would be to acknowledge that Cannae was the kind of battle where Roman soldiers got captured and came home. Rome needed Cannae to mean something different. Rome needed it to mean that those men were disgraced. The prisoners were sold into slavery. Roman citizens, captured in battle, disposed of by their own government for political coherence. The battle was not lost when the circle closed. It was lost when Rome decided it needed a victory more than it needed a plan, and when it decided afterward that the men who paid the price of that choice were inconvenient to remember correctly. Varro returned to Rome, carrying the weight of the worst military defeat in the Republic's history. Any rational reading of Roman political tradition should have meant prosecution. Exile, the kind of public destruction reserved for men who cost Rome tens of thousands of its citizens. The Senate met him at the city gates and thanked him publicly for not having despaired of the Republic. Think about that. 70,000 dead. The Senate's message: we appreciate your attitude, because Rome needed Varro's mood more than it needed his accountability. If the man who commanded at Cannae despaired, so might the next levy, the next set of consuls, the next generation of soldiers. Rome's greatest institutional strength was not its army, or its laws, or even its engineering. It was its refusal to register defeat as a permanent condition. Every catastrophe was a temporary state, preceding the next enrollment, the next campaign, the next year. Hannibal understood battlefield mechanics better than anyone alive. He did not understand this. He had calculated, and Carthage's political council had encouraged the calculation, that Cannae would fracture Rome's Italian alliance. With Rome's elite dead, its armies gone, its prestige shattered, surely the client cities and subject states of the peninsula would reassess their loyalty to a power that could no longer protect them. Some did. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, changed sides. Communities in Samnium followed, parts of Bruttium. In Sicily, Syracuse shifted. But the Latin core held. Etruria held. The communities most deeply integrated into Rome's political and economic structure, the ones with the most to lose from a Carthaginian reorganization of Italy, did not move. Without those cities, their manpower, their roads, their granaries, their walls, Hannibal's army in Italy was a fire burning without fuel. He could win every engagement. He could not take Rome. He never tried. His cavalry commander Hannibal, the officer who had engineered the destruction of Rome's horsemen at Cannae, reportedly told him directly, "Hannibal, you know how to win a victory. You do not know how to use one." Ancient sources, possibly invented, possibly not, but the observation, true or constructed, describes something real. Hannibal had achieved the greatest tactical victory of his age, and it was not enough, because the thing he needed to destroy was not an army. It was a system, and systems don't die at Cannae, they die at Zama. While Hannibal maneuvered through Italy for 15 years, winning skirmishes, raiding towns, watching his reinforcements fail to arrive, watching Carthage's political factions prioritize their suspicion of the Barca family over the war they needed him to win, Rome was building. New legions, new alliances, a new general. Publius Cornelius Scipio went to Spain and dismantled Carthage's supply architecture there. Then he landed in Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. At a field outside a town called Zama in 202 BC, the two men finally met. Scipio had studied Cannae the way a surgeon studies a wound he intends to close. He understood the double envelopment. He built his formation specifically to neutralize Hannibal's cavalry advantage before the infantry collision even began, creating lanes in his own lines to let Carthaginian war elephants pass through harmlessly, then using his own superior horsemen, once they had driven off Hannibal's cavalry, to swing around and close the circle in reverse. Cannae used against its inventor. Hannibal lost his first major battle. Carthage lost the war. Scipio received a surname he would carry to history, Africanus. Carthage did not end cleanly or quickly. It survived as a diminished political entity for another half-century before the final war in 146 BC that ended it completely. By then, Rome's destruction was total. The city razed, its population enslaved, its political existence erased so completely that even its ruins became a Roman warning to anyone who might consider challenging the system again. The story about the ground being salted to prevent crops from ever growing has been debated by historians for generations. The sources are thin, the logistics implausible. But the impulse behind the legend is accurate enough. Rome did not simply defeat Carthage. Rome wanted Carthage to stop existing as a memory. Hannibal himself survived Zama, fled into exile, drifted from one eastern court to another, always the most dangerous man in whatever room he occupied, always one step ahead of the Roman diplomats demanding his extradition. Eventually, trapped in Bithynia, with Roman agents closing in, he swallowed poison. He was in his 60s. His last recorded words, according to the sources, were something close to, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety about an old man." Dry, bitter, precise. The line of a man who understood, at the end, exactly what he had been. 200 years after the battle, Roman soldiers stationed in southern Italy were still apparently warned, informally, not to go near the old battlefield at night. Not an official prohibition, just the kind of thing you passed along. The way communities carry catastrophe in their bodies long after the documents have been filed. The field had been farmed over by then, worked for generations. But something in the local knowledge remembered what the ground had held. Rome won the war. Rome won the next war, and the one after that, and kept winning until it ran out of places to expand and began consuming itself instead. The military machine that Cannae had almost broken became, partly because of Cannae, the instrument of the most extensive Mediterranean empire the ancient world ever produced. Every province, every enslaved population, every extracted tax was in some sense downstream from the Republic's decision at Cannae to refuse to register what had happened and simply build more armies until the math changed. The families of the men sold into slavery after Cannae, Roman citizens, disposed of by their own Senate to protect a political narrative, left nothing behind. No petitions, no recorded names, no surviving appeals. They were processed by the system and erased from it, and the system continued, and the history that was written by the institution that had sold them. That's what Cannae actually was at its bottom layer, not a demonstration of Hannibal's genius, though it was that, not a testament to Roman resilience, though Rome told itself that story for centuries. It was a demonstration of what institutions do when they confuse their survival with the survival of the people inside them. When electoral momentum becomes military doctrine. When the men at the top need a victory, and the men at the bottom pay for the need. 70,000 people walked onto that plain because 2 consuls and a senate and an entire political culture had built a set of circumstances in which walking onto that plain was, for all of them, the path of least institutional resistance. The circle closed. The system continued. It always continues. That's what makes it a system. The histories that institutions don't tell about themselves, that's the territory this channel covers. If you want to keep going deeper into the stories behind the official version, subscribe. There's more where this came from,